Hi, I'm Daniel, and I'm going to be presenting a study by Kremer investigating whether therapists' unresolved trauma affects their ability to form a working alliance and whether this occurs through reduced empathy. The study draws on the wounded healer concept from Carl Jung, which suggests that therapists who experience trauma may emerge with increased empathic capabilities. However, Kremer looks to refine this idea by distinguishing between resolved and unresolved trauma. The key assumption is that trauma may enhance empathy when resolved, but impair it when unresolved. Referring to the graphic above, the study focuses on three linked constructs. Firstly, unresolved trauma, operationalized as ongoing PTSD symptoms, empathy, particularly emotional and cognitive empathy, and working alliance, defined as trust, collaboration, and agreement between therapist and client. The three key hypotheses are unresolved trauma reduces empathy, reduced empathy weakens working alliance, and intrusive PTSD symptoms mediate this relationship, meaning they explain how empathy weakens the working alliance. The study used a cross-sectional design, including a sample of therapists and trainees. It used the following established psychometric measures: the impact of event scale revised for self-reported PTSD symptoms, including intrusive PTSD symptoms, the empathy quotient, where participants rated their own ability to understand and respond to clients' thoughts and feelings, and the working alliance inventory, where participants rated their own perception of the strength of the agreement on goals, collaboration on tasks, and level of trust with the client. The analysis involved a regression, a way of testing whether one thing predicts another. Does a therapist's level of empathy here help explain how strong their relationship is with the client? And a mediation analysis, which goes one step further and asks, how or why does this relationship between emotional empathy and working alliance happen? In this case, does the link between emotional empathy and the therapist-client relationship influence the relationship directly, or is it partly working through intrusive trauma symptoms? So, in terms of the results, the key findings were trainees reported higher unresolved trauma than therapists. Contrary to the wounded hero hypothesis, trauma itself on its own did not directly predict working alliance, and unresolved trauma was associated with lower empathy, but only emotional and cognitive empathy predicted working alliance. So critically, intrusive trauma symptoms partially mediated the relationship between emotional empathy and working alliance only. However, the effect was small, meaning that only about 5% of the relationship between emotional empathy and working alliance was explained by intrusive PTSD symptoms. Enough to still be significant though. And the overall regression model explained only about 14% of the overall variance, with trauma contributing only about 7%. So, while this study is a well-designed exploratory study, it does have its methodological concerns and limitations. All the variables were self-reported. This introduces common method bias, where relationships may appear stronger because they are measured the same way. So, for example, the participants high in trauma may simply perceive themselves as less empathetic and less effective relationally. And so findings may simply reflect this shared reporting style rather than true psychological relationships. Also, Kremer acknowledges the study only explains only a small proportion of variance, as we described earlier. Furthermore, they replaced outliers with mean values, which may have reduced natural variability in the data, potentially dulling extreme cases. This can make small effects, like in the case here, appear more consistent than they would be in a variable data set. It may have made an already weak result look stronger than it actually is, which further suggests that the observed relationships are limited in their explanatory power. The study identifies a plausible pathway via intrusive symptoms, but the effect sizes and model structures suggest this pathway is relatively weak and likely interacts with other unmeasured variables. One of these unmeasured variables was already identified by the author Kremer when they noted that combining trainees and therapists in the sample may obscure meaningful differences. However, I'll go further. Trainees reported higher trauma and also likely have less clinical experience. This creates a confounded relationship. We cannot determine whether lower empathy and alliance are due to the unresolved trauma, a lack of experience, or both interacting. The overall findings might simply reflect an overrepresentation of trainees in the unresolved trauma group rather than a true psychological process of unresolved trauma on therapists and its resultant impact on empathy and working alliance. So now the author interprets their findings in two key ways, which I'll bring up on screen now. First, they proposed that unresolved trauma led to emotional numbing, which reduces empathy. Second, they suggest that intrusive symptoms cause distraction, meaning that the therapists are less able to focus on the client. And while the results establish that unresolved trauma and emotional empathy are related in their effect on working alliance, I believe Kremer's explanation of the results draws too narrowly on PTSD symptom explanations and does not sufficiently integrate broader psychotherapy literature. Firstly, numbing is recognized as a feature of PTSD. It is only one possible explanation of why intrusive symptoms could reduce empathy. Secondly, Kremer suggests that therapists are distracted, but this statement is presented without an evidence base. So while it's introduced, it is not defined, explained, or measured. And I'll present on screen some missing factors I think we need to consider. For instance, the research shows that working alliance is primarily shaped by therapists' relational skills, responsiveness, and interpersonal competence. From an evolutionary perspective, empathy is shaped by stress regulation symptoms. And from a humanistic perspective, individuals are motivated towards self-actualization. So, put together, this suggests that while unresolved trauma may impact working alliance, it might be better explained through indirect effects on ongoing relational functioning. Kremer's explanation instead fixates on how specific PTSD symptoms are acting through this single therapeutic mechanism instances with the client. This overlooks overall neurobiological processes and motivational factors that may disrupt a therapist's emotional regulation or their ongoing relational skills. It treats PTSD symptoms as a driver rather than a possible byproduct of broader dysfunction. So, overall, the study provides insight into complex relationship between trauma, empathy, and working alliance, and it uses established validated measures to provide a foundation for future research. It adds nuance to the wounded healer concept rather than broadly suggesting trauma enhances therapeutic capacity, which it did not even show. The findings instead indicate that specifically unresolved trauma is associated with poorer empathy and reduced working alliance. This is clinically useful distinction because it shifts the focus on how the resolution of trauma is what really matters for therapists rather than the experience of trauma itself. However, the study has methodological limitations and the results demonstrated limited explanatory power. A more accurate interpretation might be that unresolved trauma is only one small factor within a very complex system interacting with specifically relational skill, experience, and psychological development. Clinically, this suggests, as highlighted by the author, that there is a further need for longitudinal research which specifically uses multi-method assessments. However, due to methodological limitations, the findings should not yet guide interventions. Instead, there needs to be an integration of relational factors and developmental frameworks. Kremer's study advances the literature by identifying a plausible but weak pathway linking unresolved trauma, empathy, and working alliance. However, a more integrated framework is needed to fully understand how therapist trauma shapes therapeutic relationships and therefore the impact on therapeutic outcomes. And I'll present my references up on screen right now as well. Thank you. Thanks.